In this unit, we will explore the depressive disorders. In terms of the DSM and an overview of the depressive disorders, I will explore the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, major depressive disorders, which include major depressive episode, a persistent depressive disorder or dysthymia, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, substance and medication-induced depressive disorder due to another medical condition, and other specified depressive disorders and unspecified depressive disorders. The common feature of all these disorders is the presence of sad, empty, and irritable mood, accompanied by somatic and cognitive changes that significantly affect an individual's capacity to function. And what differs among them are the duration, timing, and presumed etiology. The first of the depressive disorders is the disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. This is the presentation of children with persistent irritability and frequent episodes of extreme behavioral discontrol. It is added to the depressive disorders for children up to 12 years of age. Let's take a look at the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. So let's look at the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. We're talking about A, severe reoccurrent temper outbursts manifested verbally by verbal rages, yelling, screaming, swearing, or behaviorally through physical aggression towards people and property that are grossly out of proportion in intensity and duration to the situation or the provocation. So we're talking about children who are losing control verbally and physically in environments and at times when it's inappropriate to do so, and doing so way out of proportion in terms of what circumstances led to the outbursts. The temper outbursts are inconsistent with the developmental levels, so we're talking about maybe a more mature middle-aged child as opposed to a 3-year-old having a temper tantrum. The temper outbursts occur on average 3 or 4 more times a week, and the mood between the temper outbursts is persistently irritable or angry most of the day, nearly every day, and observed by others like teachers, parents, and peers. Criterion E, we would look at A through D having to be present for 12 or more months. So we're talking about a long period of time. Throughout that day, the individuals had a period lasting 3 or more consecutive months without all of the symptoms of A through D. Criterion A and D are present at least 2 or more of the settings. So for example, we're looking at these behaviors happening at school, at home, or with peers, and that are severe in at least one of these settings. The diagnosis should not be made for the first time before the age of 16 and not after 18, before the age of 6 years old and not after the age of 18. And of course, by history or observation, the age of onset of criteria A through E is before 10 years of age. The Diagnostic Statistics Manual, the DSM-5, tells us that there has never been a distinct period lasting more than 1 day during which full symptoms criteria, except duration for a manic or hypomanic episode, have not been met. The DSM then goes down to tell us more about behaviors that do not occur exclusively during the episodes, and symptoms attributed to other physical or substance or medicational or neurological conditions would have to be eliminated before this particular depressive disorder were to be considered for a child or youth. The major depressive disorder, which includes a major depressive episode, is a discrete episode of at least 2 weeks duration, although most episodes last considerably longer, involving clear-cut changes in affect, cognition, and neurovegetative functions and inter-episode remissions. So what do we mean by this? Affect, how somebody presents, the way I have my facial expressions, my gesture, my presence, my mood. Cognition, which would be my thinking about myself and others in situations. Neurovegetative functions could be around how I am behaving in terms of am I sleeping a lot? not? Am I having other symptoms, physical and or psychophysical? And inter-episode remissions, are there moments in between episodes where I'm doing well? So that's what a major depressive disorder is. So let's look at the DSM diagnostic criteria of the major depressive disorder and learn that 5 or more of the following symptoms have to be present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms, either one, depressed mood, or loss in interest or pleasure. Note that you're not to include symptoms that are clearly attributed to another medical condition. So, for example, if somebody had some kind of memory loss, neurological condition, extra sleeping because of some other medical condition, you would not include those symptoms. So what we're talking about is one, depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, is indicated by either subjective reporting, so somebody who's saying I'm feeling sad or empty and hopeless, or observations made by others. So I might think that somebody appears tearful. And in children and adolescents, these can be irritable mood. We're talking about a markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day, is indicated by either, again, subjective accounts or observations. We're looking to another symptom of significant weight loss when not dieting, or weight gain. So, for example, a change of more than 5% of one's body weight in a month, or a decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. And in children, you must consider failure to make expected weight gain. In terms of sleep, we look to insomnia or hyperinsomnia nearly every day, so too much sleeping or not enough sleeping, psychomotor agitation or retardation nearly every day, observed by others, not merely subjective feelings of restlessness, but being slowed down. So we're talking about a slowing down of motor functioning. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day, and reoccurrent thoughts of death, not just a fear of dying, but reoccurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan or a suicide attempt or a specific plan of committing suicide. And of course, the symptoms cause significantly, clinically significant distress or impairment in one's social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And the episode, again, is not attributed to the psychological effects of a substance or other medical condition. So as you can see, the DSM provides very specific details of the major depressive disorder and the diagnostic criteria of the disorder. The persistent depressive disorder can be diagnosed when the mood disturbance continues for at least 2 years in adults and 1 year in children, and you can see here the diagnostic criteria for that is very clear. And I'm going to spare you from me reading through the diagnostic criteria for the next few disorders. What I'm going to invite you to do is to log into the DSM and to explore these on your own, and when I'm finished looking at the next a couple of slides, I will show you how to do that again. So the premenstrual dysphoric disorder is a specific and treatment-responsive form of depressive disorders that begins sometime following ovulation and remits within a few days of menses and has a marked impact on functioning. Again, take the time to look at the diagnostic criteria for this particular disorder, but remember that this disorder, like any other disorder, must demonstrate criteria and diagnostic factors that have a significant impact on your one's ability to function. The next disorder is the substance medication-induced depressive disorder and the depressive disorder due to another medical condition. And of course, these are a large number of substances that are abused, some prescribed medications, and several medical conditions that can be associated with depression-like phenomena, or there are, again, other medical conditions that can contribute to a depressive disorder. So fundamentally, Depression is similar in children and adults, and prevalence of depression seems to be similar across subcultures. The relationship between anxiety and depression and negative affect is very clear. Most depressed persons are anxious, but not all anxious persons are depressed. In terms of worldwide prevalence, 16% of the human condition would meet the criteria for some kind of major depression. And in terms of sex differences, females are twice as likely to have a major depression, and the gender imbalance tends to disappear after the age of 65. In terms of genetical components, in terms of twin studies, there are a lot of concordance rates with high depression in identical twins. Several mood and or depressive disorders have strong genetic contributions, and hereditability rates are higher for females compared to males. And there is some other vulnerabilities around bipolar and unipolar, and that will be discussed in a later chapter. But it appears to be inherited separately. In terms of neurobiological influences, depression is influenced by neurotransmitter systems, serotonin, and its other relations to other neurotransmitters. And mood disorders and depressive disorders are related to low levels of serotonin. Neurobiological influences include the endocrine system, which is an important system to how our bodies function. And when we are stressed and not well, we have elevated cortisol. And this depressive cortisol secretion can actually make people be unwell and feeling unwell. Sleep disturbances also impact depressive disorders and mood disorders. Sleep disturbances are the hallmark of the depressive disorders, and there's a relationship, very significant correlation between depression and sleep. Stressful life events and stressful events in general are related to depressive and mood disorders. And when we have stress, we have poor response to treatment and longer time remission. The relationship between context and life events and our moods and our depression is very clear. What's good for you may not be good for others, and so it depends on stress, and stress factors impact people differently. So for example, in my life, I have a lot of work in terms of working with complex people, and they have a lot of crisis, and I support those folks during crisis. And these particular crises, although maybe stressful, don't impact me the same way they might impact somebody else. And then, of course, there is some ideas around an environmental model and a reciprocal gene in terms of depression. There are other theories, like the learned helplessness theory of depression, where we lack perceived control over our life, the learned life events and learned helplessness, and a depressive attributional style is formed. We have internal attributions. We think about ourselves, and our negative outcomes are essentially becoming our own fault in our own mind. It's our fault that we have negative outcomes. We believe negative outcomes will be one's fault, and then globally we believe negative effects will disrupt many life events and activities, and all three domains contribute to a sense of hopelessness. The cognitive theory is the idea of negative coping styles. Depressed persons engage in cognitive errors. Cognitive meaning thinking errors. They have to tend to interpret life events negatively. So, for example, here I am teaching you, and a few moments ago the oven stove began to beep. A depressed person might think, "Oh, that stove again! It's always interrupting me. I was recording videos, and now I have to start again." Alternatively, I heard it. I thought to myself, I'm at my home, the stove's recording, the video's recording, I don't care about the beeping of the stove. So my coping style was more positive than negative. We make cognitive errors when people are depressed. Types of cognitive errors are, there's the stove again. Types of cognitive errors are arbitrary inferences, where we overemphasize the negative. Oh God, that stove again, it's always disrupting me. Or overgeneralizations, where we begin to have negatives applying to all situations. So in terms of cognitive theory, cognitive errors and depressed cognitive triad exists. You think negatively about oneself, when one thinks negatively about the world, and of course when one thinks negatively about the future, and you combine those things, you get a triad that is not very supportive and helpful in terms of your negative conditions. And so this is Beck's cognitive triad for depression. When you think negatively about yourself and the world and your future, then you will have a negative outcome and depression. And so, of course, one of the things we can do as child and youth care practitioners is help our children and youth think positively about themselves, help them learn ways to think and engage in the world positively, and to have a future outlook that's positive, and so that there is a better chance of a positive outcome. What about the cultural and social dimensions of depression in terms of marital relations? Marital dissatisfaction is strongly related to depression, and this relation is particularly strong in males. In terms of mood disorders in women, the mood disorders and depression favor females over males, except for the bipolar disorders, which we will talk to later on. And the general gender imbalance is likely to do with socialization, meaning that perhaps one hypothesis could be that females tend to talk more and seek support about when they're feeling depressed, as males who would more internalize and tend not to talk about feelings. And these ideas of talking about feelings is to do with how we were socialized. Social support is really important. An extent of the social support that somebody has is related to depression. So lack of social support predicts late onset of depression, and substantial social support predicts recovery from depression. So what we know from this in terms of providing an intervention for people who have depression, and that is we have a lot of positive outcomes when individuals have good social supports. In terms of the integrated theory, we know that mental health issues are not just, psycho or social, but we do have biological vulnerability. And the folks who are depressed tend to have overactive neurobiological responses to stress. Again, we talked about exposure to stress activating hormones that affect neurotransmitter systems and turn on certain genes and affect certain circadian rhythms. So there is a significant biological component, and those are connected to stress. This exposure to stress activates dormant psychological vulnerabilities and contributes to a sense of uncontrollability and fosters a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. In terms of this particular exposure to stress, again, social and interpersonal relationships and support are the moderators for good outcomes. How else do we treat? Medication is a very effective treatment to depression. And although I didn't talk a lot about medication in the last lesson with regards to anxiety, I leave that to you to explore for anxiety in the DSM. I'll talk about medication as it relates to depression. And in terms of depression, the tricyclic medications, were widely used, and these block reuptake of norepinephrine and other neurotransmitters. And their therapeutic effects can take anywhere between 2 and 8 weeks. Unfortunately, for the tricyclic medications, the negative side effects are common. And for those taking them in terms of lethal dosages, excessive dosages could be lethal. So they're not the first choice of treatment for the individuals with depression. The MOAs, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors block monoamine oxidase. This enzyme breaks down the serotonin and norepinephrine and slightly more effective than the tricyclics are. The monoamine oxidase inhibitors are are sensitive to foods that contain trimine, so trimine. So examples include beer, red wine, and cheese, and many patients don't like the dietary restrictions that come with the MAOs.